ended up in a ditch. I mean, haven't we known folks who start off and there was a friendship. In just a few months, maybe a few years later, that friendship turned into an affair. And the chaos that was unleashed. Maybe it was somebody who started off with a habit, and the habit didn't seem like that big a deal until it got out of control. We had a bad parenting decision, and we ended up in a ditch. Over and over again, we see certain destinations that people we love and people we care about end up in, and we say, what happened? In fact, we'll even say to ourselves, what were they thinking, right? Or we look back at seasons in our own life, we say, what was I thinking when I did that? And we say, well, I wasn't thinking when I did that. That was the problem. See, what we're going to discover today is that our attention, not our intention, determines our destination. You see, we'll say to ourselves many times, let me grab my Bible over here. Many times we'll say to ourselves, I never intended to end up in that spot. I never intended for that to happen. I never intended for people to be hurt. I never intended to go that far. We say this kind of thing all the time. And when we say that, when we tell folks and say to ourselves, I never intended for that to happen, we imagine that if we intend for it to happen, it won't happen. But our intentions do not determine our destinations. They don't. Dr. Laura Stahali wrote a book called Triangles. And in this book, she does the research on why men and women have affairs. She said 60 to 80%, now think about that, 60 to 80% of upper middle class marriages will experience the pain of an extramarital affair. 60 to 80%. And yet, she says, when you ask anyone going into marriage, no one intends to cause that pain. No one intends to have that kind of betrayal. No one intends to have that kind of destination. She tells the story of Jeff. Jeff was religious. He went to church. He had a label. He was a Lutheran. He was a Baptist. He was whatever. But he found himself dating a young woman. He said it got easier and easier to lie to his wife because his wife thought he was religious and wouldn't do that kind of a thing, right? He would say he was going on a hunting trip, he would kennel the dogs, and he'd take his girlfriend to the Bahamas for the week. In her research, she shows that it's not just men, women are just as likely to have an affair. She tells the story of a young woman named Jane. She's 34. She'd been married 10 years, and she just felt trapped. She felt trapped by life. She felt like, I don't have any choices anymore. I'm just sort of taxing the kids around all the time. She started back in a new job, and her job, she was a little bored by it. A little lonely in life in general in her marriage. She met a guy named Jeff, and they began to work together. It was harmless. It was just friendship. And Jeff said, hey, why don't we meet for lunch over this project we're working on together? He goes, you know, it might cause some talk for me to be seen with such a pretty woman like you. Well, she hadn't been called pretty in a long time. And they began to meet for lunch. It was just work, but they never intended it to go anywhere. They never intended to do anything wrong. But months of laughter and lunches and friendship together, and then the day came when she said, hey, I got a little leftover chili at home. Why don't you come over to my house? We'll finish up the chili. And that's where the physical affair began. And yet, do you know Cosmopolitan magazine did a research study with couples and said that couples who get into the fantasy of an affair or the challenges of temptation, 80% of them, after all the tragedy is done, after everything comes crashing down, 80% of people would go back to their former spouse. So why is it that we get sucked into temptation when we start thinking again, 80% of us say, well, I'd go back to what I had. Well, here's why. It's this lie we tell ourselves. We tell ourselves that it's our intention, not our attention, that determines our destination. If you give your intention to the cute intern to just check and see if she has everything she needs, I can tell you that there's a destination to that. You can say, well, I didn't intend to become an alcoholic, but when you attend to pain and difficulty by medicating it with sex or with alcohol or with drugs or with over shopping or whatever it is, whether you intend to go to a destination or not, what you give your attention to will determine it. All of us intend to have great marriages. All of us intend to have a great family life. But if we look at our calendars and we don't attend to family nights and we don't attend to a regular date night with our spouse, we're going to wake up at empty nest and say, who's that person I'm living with? Nobody intends to be covered in debt. Everybody intends. We hear people say all the time, if I had $1 million, I'd be more generous. Everybody intends to be generous and intends not to be stressed out by debt. And yet your attention to your giving, your attention to your spending, your attention to your budget will determine your destination. That's just how life works. I meet with couples at funerals many times, our whole team does. And folks will say, I always intended to get things right with my dad. I always intended to tell him I loved him. I always intended to say I was sorry. I always intended to tell Mom I forgave her. But your intentions do not determine your destination. It's what you and I give our attention to that determines our destination. And nowhere do we see that more clearly than in 3 books of the Bible we're going to look at today, in 3 characters. 3 guys with great intentions. A king named Saul, a king named David, and a king named Solomon. Our first king, we began speaking about last week, and he was a ruler. So if you have your paper with you and you want to draw a ruler with me, the first ruler or monarch of the nation of Israel was a man named Saul. He was a ruler. And he had hopes. He came into the kingdom with hopes of having a great dynamic faith. God used him to do miraculous things. He wanted to have a great family. He wanted to have a great future. He never intended to lose his relationship with his kids. He never intended to be lonely. He never intended to be bitter. He never intended to be consumed with jealousy. But there are 2 critical moments in his life where he becomes a rule breaker. 2 moments. See, Samuel was a prophet at the time, and Samuel came to him and said, God has something for you to do, and I want you to trust him. You're going to go to battle. But before you go to battle, wait for me. I'm going to come and I'm going to prepare a sacrifice to trust in God that he will give us victory. So Saul, wait on God. Wait on his timing. I will come and then we'll go to battle. Well, Samuel hasn't shown up yet. And Saul's waiting, and he's waiting. And all of a sudden, he's giving his attention to the battle lines. His generals are saying, we got to go. We got to go now. The bad guys are closing in. Now, he remembers the voice of Samuel saying, wait, wait, wait. But temptation never wants to wait, does it? Temptation says, go, 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 go. If not now, never. So Saul finally says, well, I got to take things in my own hands. And Saul does the sacrifice. Now, he knew God said kings should not give sacrifices. That was a role of the priest. He knew that God had said, wait. But he didn't wait. He gave the sacrifice. He gives the sacrifice, says, let's go. And Samuel shows up and says, Saul, what have you done? What have you done? And Saul, instead of taking responsibility for it, instead of owning it, he begins to blame. Well, you weren't here. You didn't get here in time. It's your fault. If you had got here in time, I wouldn't have had to do this. If the battle lines hadn't been so long, if people weren't crying out, I had circumstances that called for me to compromise. I didn't intend to have to do this. And he never confesses, and he never agrees, and he never takes responsibility. Well, I said there were 2 moments. So Samuel turns to Saul and says, well, then here's your next assignment. I want you to go to this particular wicked, rebellious city. But when you conquer the city, do not take any of the cattle or any of the sheep. Because that sheep and that cattle was money used to exploit people, for human trafficking, for all kinds of terrible things. Do not take any of the cattle. So Saul goes to battle, and all of a sudden he's got all this cattle after he wins. All these sheep. Seems like a shame not to take them. Seems like a shame not to have them. They're just sitting there. They're just going to go to waste. I got an idea. We'll sacrifice. We'll take 1/3 of them and sacrifice them to God. God, these are for you. And we'll keep the other 2/3. And we'll sort of buy God off. Well, at this point, he's so losing his ability to know right and wrong, he actually thinks he's obeyed God. Samuel shows up and says, so, Saul, did you obey God? And Saul says, I sure did. And Samuel gets a little crankety. Then what is the bleating of sheep I hear in my ears? You didn't obey God. You didn't do what he said. And Saul, again, does not give his attention to taking responsibility, to confessing or agreeing with what he did. He won't do it. So Samuel says, well, God's going to take the kingdom from you and give it to somebody better than you. Somebody who will trust him. Somebody that will put his plan ahead of their plan. Well, Saul gets angry. He's going to lose his kingdom. And he's angry. He's angry not at himself. He's angry not at what he did. He's angry at Samuel for calling him out on it. He's angry at God for doing this to him. Well, he falls into a deep depression. He finds himself sitting around with his spear, and this darkness comes over him. This depression comes over him. This ugly feeling comes over him. And they say, the people in this court say, we got to help him out. But the more and more, he doesn't intend to be depressed, but he doesn't do anything different to change his condition. He sits by himself. He withdraws from other people. So they call him a shepherd boy. And he begins to play music. And that worship music lifts his spirits. And for a few moments, he won't feel as depressed. He won't feel as dark. But pretty soon he needs a bigger hit of music, a little bit longer music. And pretty soon the music's no longer getting rid of his depression. Pretty soon the music's no longer taking away the deep spirit. And pretty soon he decides that the reason he's feeling dark and the reason he's feeling depressed, it's his fault. It's the musician's fault. If he would play better, I'd feel better. And he grabs a spear and he throws it across the room and tries to pin this young musician against the wall, and he dives out of the way. And they say, oh, I'm so sorry. I never intended for that to happen. Oh, so sorry. Could you come back and play? And he comes back and he plays more. He never intended to do it again. He never intended to hurt somebody again. But sure enough, he grabs that spear and a second time throws it across. And that little musician, shepherd boy, is named David, and he begins to run. Because pretty soon, he becomes a scapegoat. Now Saul decides that David, that musician, all his problems in the world are because of David. David had married his daughter, and he says to his daughter, Miguel, choose. You're either with me or you're with that guy. And he gives his attention to jealousy and envy, and he says, honey, are you going to choose me or your husband? It's one or the other. And he loses his relationship with his daughter out of envy. He turns to his son Jonathan. He says, Jonathan, what are you doing? You're siding with David. You're either with me or with him. And he loses his relationship with Jonathan. He never intended to do it, but he kept giving his attention to his jealousy. He kept giving his attention to his envy. So he's now hunting David up and down the field. And David's hiding out. David is hiding out. And one night, as King Saul is going through the field trying to kill him off, David tiptoes his way into the king's camp, and he steals his spear and his water jug. All these armed guards and David and his men grab these two, and they come up to the top of the mountain and wake him up the next day. Hey, king, wake up! It's David! That's who we're after! Look, I have your spear, and I have your water jug. I could have killed you last night. If I meant you harm, I would have done it. I'm not against you. I'm for you. Forgive me. Let go of your envy. Stop giving attention to me. Oh. And King Saul apologized. I'm so sorry. I never intended for it to get this far. I never intended to let my anger and my jealousy and my envy take over. I never intended. But it doesn't last very long because his intentions don't determine his destination. He begins to give his attention to his jealousy again. And he again just cannot take responsibility for himself. He cannot realize that maybe he is part of the blame to his issues. And he begins to be consumed by anger and consumed by jealousy. And now he's lonely. His family's not with him. His daughter's not talking to him. His son's not talking to him. He begins to sweep all the consequences of what he had done under the rug and blame other people. And we find him in the final scene of his life, visiting the Witch of Endor. Sounds like something from Star Wars. The Witch of Endor. Now, years earlier, when he became king and ruler of the country, he had outlawed this kind of superstitious practice. He knew God had said that we should trust him for the future, not talk to other people about the dead. But King Saul wants to talk to God, and Samuel has died. And he doesn't know how to talk to God because he refuses to take responsibility for what he did. He wants to come to God on his terms. The only way he thinks he can talk to God is to go to a witch. So he goes to this superstitious practice, this witch, trying to talk to God. And ultimately, just a few days later, the destination of Saul's life is that he dies in battle, alone, his faith disintegrated, his future destroyed, his family torn apart. he never intended, if you had asked him at the beginning of his reign, hey, I think you're going to end up at the witch's house, and then you're going to end up friendless, lonely, and familyless, he'd say, I never intend to do that. But his intentions didn't determine his destination. What he gave his attention to in his life did. And that's the book of 1 Samuel. The next book of the Bible is called 2 Samuel, and it tells the story of that shepherd boy. And that shepherd boy also had great intentions. He had intentions of having a life of faith. He had intentions of having a great family and a great future. In fact, he's a rising star. He's most famous, this shepherd boy, because he used to live out in the field and take care of his dad's flocks. And as he took care of his dad's flocks, he learned how to use that sling. He'd kill off bears and lions to protect the flock. And one day, his dad tells him to show up to King Saul and the army and to visit his older brothers. And as he does, there's Goliath there, and everybody's giving their attention to how big Goliath is and how monstrous he is, but not this shepherd boy. He gives his attention to how big God is. He says, God could use me, and I intend to destroy the giant by giving my attention on God. And he does. It's the first recorded incidence of rock and roll in the Bible. One rock rolled the giant, and he had to Goliath down forever. And that's where he killed Goliath. And at that point, his reward is he marries the king's daughter. He becomes a rising star. People begin to sing songs about him. Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Victory after victory, this guy is on a rising pattern. In fact, if you have the book of 2 Samuel open and you just read the chapter headings, David anointed king. David reigns over Israel. The conquest of Jerusalem. The Philistines are defeated. The ark is brought to Jerusalem. God's covenant with David. David's thanksgiving to God. David's further conquest. David's administration. David's kindness to Mephibosheth. The Ammonites and Syrians defeated. This guy is on a roll. 10 chapters. He is a rising star with all intentions of leading the people back to a faith and a future and a family like God intended. That's where he was. Great intentions for an incredible destination, and he was tracking to reach that destination. Until 2 Samuel chapter 11. His success has him bored. He's bored. At a time when kings go out to war, he finds himself not going out to battle. He finds himself sort of bored. His job's gotten a little too easy for him. He finds himself wandering around the royal balcony one day, and he looks out. All the other men are out fighting. He's home alone with all the wives and the women who didn't go to battle. And while he's strolling along the royal banquet, or royal balcony, he sees a woman in a bathtub. We'll make it a bubble bath. And the woman in the bath, ironically, her name is Bathsheba. And he gives his attention to her. Now, he knows he's married. He knows God said one man and one woman, that's the way to go. But he gives his attention to Bathsheba. At that point, he could say, whoa, no, I don't want to head down this destination. But he takes another choice. He sends for her. Bring Bathsheba to me. She comes, she says, hey, how are you? My husband Uriah works for you. He's in battle. Whoa, your husband? He could have given his attention to the word husband, but he didn't. Instead, he gave his attention to how beautiful she was and how lonely she felt. And so they began an affair. Now, he never intended for it to go as far as it did. He never intended for her to show up a little bit later and say, I'm pregnant. He never intended to lie. He never intended to cover up. But what do? We can't let people know that the king of Israel, the man after God's heart, has done this kind of thing. So he calls Uriah in for battle. He says, hey, good to have you in the kingdom. I just want to honor you and let you go home and enjoy your wife. And Uriah has such incredible integrity. He goes, no, if my men are out in battle fighting and they don't get to go home to their wives, I'm not going to go enjoy my wife. Really? He didn't intend him to get him drunk, or maybe he did at that point. He got him drunk hoping that would get him to go home to his wife, but he still wouldn't. He laid out in the outer balcony or outer area of the court, refusing to go and visit his wife. Well, David knew the only thing he could do was thank Uriah for his service and hand him a scroll. And on that scroll that was sealed, that he would hand to his military commander, would say, put Uriah at the front of battle so that he will be killed. And Uriah had him murdered. David had Uriah murdered. This tipping point in 2 Samuel chapter 11 is where he began to give his attention to lying, to deceiving, to lust, to thinking that he was above the rules, to thinking that he knew better than God. And here he became an adulterer, he became a liar, and he became a killer. Not because he intended to, but because that's where he gave his attention. And if you begin to read the chapter headings in the next 10 chapters, it's painful. It is incredibly painful. Because David, out of the embarrassment of what happened, he does confess. In fact, there's some beautiful words in the Bible. He says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." And God forgives him, and God cleanses him, and God gives him a fresh start. But though he gave attention to bad things in chapter 11, something happened in him, and he's never able to give the attention to his house that it needs. And his household begins to crack. You see, he wasn't giving attention to the fact that now he's married 2 women. And because of that, from one woman is a daughter named Tamar, and she's beautiful. From another wife is a son named Amnon. And Amnon is in lust with his half-sister. But David doesn't give his attention to see it. So when he fakes and pretends like he's sick, David sends Tamar into him, and she gets raped. And the news gets out of what has happened. And David is embarrassed. He doesn't know what to do. He can't give his attention to his little girl who needs his protection, needs his love, and needs his healing. As the ruler of the land, it was his job to do justice, to call Amnon to account, and he never did it. He never gave attention to this issue. Hide it, pretend it never happened. Tamar's brother Absalom says, "Dad, when are you going to do something?" And he waited months. 2 years he waited. And Dad didn't do anything. So Absalom took things in his own hands. Absalom saw his daughter had been raped, and he killed his own half-brother Amnon. And it cracked again. And Absalom ran off to the far side of the country. 2 Samuel says that David longed to go to him. He longed to go to him. He intended to go to him, but he never went to him. And that sets up a discord between Absalom and David that will shatter the kingdom. Because Absalom will eventually lead a rebellion that comes back and drives David and drives his entire kingdom out of the kingdom and into the wilderness. And David is now running around like he used to. And Absalom is now hunting his own father. And one day Absalom's hair apparently was very, very long, because as he was going on his horse, some branches caught his hair, and his horse continued, and here he is suspended between heaven and earth. And David's general, Joab, comes along, and he sees Absalom, and he kills him right there in the tree, swinging between heaven and earth. And at that moment, as the fracture of the kingdom has occurred, as the fracture of his family has occurred, we hear these just guttural sounds coming from David as he says, "Absalom, Absalom, my son, if only it had been me and not you." And we see an incredibly painful scene of regret, a painful moment of remorse, where a father saw his family split in half, a painful destination for his kingdom, one that he never intended. He never intended to end here. He never intended that kind of pain. But because of what he gave his attention to and didn't give his attention to, he ended here. But again, God is a God of grace. And God continues to use people in David's families. In fact, his son Solomon, born of Bathsheba, who he was now married to, who grew up in that mess. They had fame, they had fortune, they had it all. In the book of 1 Kings, Solomon comes to reign. And he comes to reign, and God comes to him and says, "I want to offer you a gift. Here's the gift. You can have whatever you want." Think about that. God shows up and says, "You can have whatever you want." And Solomon says, "You know what? I grew up in a disaster. We had fame, we had fortune, we had popularity, but I know what it's like to look good in public, but underneath, in the private life, you got devastation. You know what we need? And you know what I like, God? Wisdom. Could you give me wisdom? That's what I'd like. I like some wisdom for handling the difficult stuff in life. I don't want to have the kind of family that my dad had. I want a different kind of family. I want to lead my folks back to worship, not because of the troubles and difficulties and potholes. I want to lead people to miss out on those kind of pains because they follow God's wisdom." And God is so pleased that he asked for wisdom. God offers him love, God offers him fame, and God offers him fortune. And he becomes known for his wisdom. Two young mothers are fighting over whose baby is whose, and he uses his wisdom to discern whose it is. The Queen of Sheba will travel all around the world to hear about his wisdom. And if you ask Solomon, what are your intentions? I intend to have a great family. I intend to have a great relationship with God. I intend to have great wisdom, be a rising star, but to do it God's way. In fact, he becomes an author. He writes 3 books. And these 3 books, he outlines his wisdom. 3 books. 1, 2, 3. Book number 1 is called Proverbs. He writes Proverbs. It's God's wisdom about money. It's God's wisdom about relationships. It's about not giving your attention to lust or the adulteress. It's about giving your attention to financial giving and giving God the first portion of your income. It's all this wisdom about life, about leadership, about challenges. It's 31 chapters of wisdom. Book number 2, the Song of Solomon. Unlike his father, who had 2 or 3 wives, he was going to have 1 wife. And he and his wife write this book called The Song of Solomon. It's about the beauty of physical intimacy in marriage. The first couple chapters about why you should wait until you're married to have sexual relationship. Not because God's prudish about it, but because this gift is so powerful. We don't want to awaken love until it's time. And then he talks about the beauty of his relationship with his wife, and we actually have a front row seat to their wedding night. Next couple chapters, they talk about the conflict they have in the bedroom, and that things don't always go the way they want, but how they work through it with God's grace. And the last chapters talk about ending their relationship, making the second half of their marriage better than the first, keeping attention on their marriage, keeping attention on each other's needs, keeping attention on loving the other person. It's a beautiful picture of his intentions. And then he wrote book number 3, the book of Ecclesiastes. At this point, he's hit midlife crisis. At this point, somewhere along the way, he picked up a second wife, and maybe a third. At this point in his life, he decided that I don't intend anything bad to happen, but let's see what happens if I could find my meaning and purpose by making some building projects, or accumulating money, or trying out all kinds of weird, kinky things in relationships. And chapter by chapter, he says, I tried it all. I didn't intend to, but I did. And he says, I am as hollow and as empty as ever. The theme of Ecclesiastes is life is vanity without God. It's meaningless. I've got this God-shaped hole in my life, and nothing is filling it, not all the stuff. And I had access, as the leader I was, I had access to everything. And it didn't satisfy. And over those years, Solomon begins to give his attention to all kinds of things in life that he had talked about in the book of Proverbs not to do. And at the end of his life, God had warned him. He said, hey, there are consequences coming. If you don't have a whole heart for me, if you don't love me with your heart, your soul, and your mind, if you don't do things my way, you're going to lose the kingdom. It's going to be lost from you. You're going to break up the kingdom. And sure enough, his heart gets broken toward God in half. He didn't intend to split Dad's kingdom, but his kingdom will be split in half. He ruined Dad's business. He ruined Dad's kingdom. Everything came apart. He never intended for that to happen, but 2 things did it: his foreign wives and his treaties. You see, in those days, if you wanted the neighboring nation not to attack you, you'd marry the pharaoh or the king's daughter. That way they don't kill you because they're not going to kill off their own daughter. So he took a wife just for security for the kingdom. It'll help other people out. It'll be good for everybody. It's not that I want another wife. I'm doing it for others. Well, somewhere he ends up with 700 wives and 700 concubines. And each one of them comes with a different religion. And they say, hey, keep your God and your Jehovah and your Yahweh. But why don't we have a temple for your God plus our gods? And he begins to dilute his passion for God. He begins all kinds of philosophies and religions come in. And ultimately the kingdom is ripped in half. He did not intend for this to happen. Nobody intends for this to happen. Nobody wants to be the one who ruined Dad's business and ruined Dad's dream, or split the kingdom, is known for tearing it all apart. But here's where we get practical. The takeaway from these 3 lives: David in the middle, Saul up top, Solomon at the bottom, is we need to give attention to what we're giving our attention to. We need to stop lying to ourselves. And I do it all the time. I lie to myself and say, well, if I intend not to get hurt, I won't get hurt. Intentions do not determine destinations. They just don't. And there's no better way to find out your real intentions. There's no better way than to pull out one of two things. Pull out your calendar and pull out your checkbook. Look at it. Where are you giving your attention to? In the last 90 days, have you given any time to your marriage in your calendar? Any date nights in the last 90 days? Are you characterized by that? Whether you intend to drift apart or not, if you're not giving attention in your calendar to that. I had a terrifying moment this week. My daughter got hit by a car on Tuesday. And I got the phone call that started off with, she's okay, but your daughter got hit by a car. There's nothing like that moment to say, how am I spending my time? Am I watching one more TV show when I could go sit on her bed and say, honey, how are you doing? Look at your calendar and look at your checkbook. You might say, I don't intend to overspend. Look at your checkbook. Are you spending more than you take in? It doesn't matter if you intend to bring friction and stress in your marriage or not. You will, because of what you're spending. You might say, well, I intend to be a giver. Well, in the last 90 days, are you giving away not $20 or $30? Are you giving away a percentage of your income? You're never going to be on the track to a generous destination if you don't give attention to giving. That's just how it works. That's just how life is. I want to have great friendships. Well, in the last 90 days in your calendar, is there any time invested in friendships? Well, I intend to build friendships one day. All right, well, your intentions aren't going to determine your destinations. How about your spiritual growth? You say, well, Chad, you passed out that fast track Bible. I had all intentions of reading it. We're 3 weeks in. You told me it would take an hour, but I haven't got to it yet. Well, you don't have to read the fast track booklet. But if you look at the last 90 days in your calendar and there's no time for prayer or reflection or Bible study or really to think about what you're thinking about, I can just tell you the destination you're headed toward. And I don't want that for you. God doesn't want that for you. He has something far better for you. But the only way we're going to get our heads around this, the only way we're going to come to grips with this is we finally come to the place we stop lying to ourselves about our intentions and we start being honest about our attentions. I read 2 stories that remind me of this. Football coach John McKay was the winningest coach in the history of the University of Southern California. He compiled a record of 127 to 40 to 8 from 1960 to 1975. Don Coryell worked as his assistant. When I was working with him, one of our players found the opposing team's game book in the locker room. He brought it to me and said, what should we do with this? I better show it to John. I brought it to John and told him what it was. Without giving his attention to it, without even glancing at it, he took it in his hand, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it away. He said, great coaches win honestly. No cheating, no cutting corners. He gave his attention to this. It hadn't been his intention to find it, but he refused to give his attention to it. He knew that if he gave his attention to it, it would set him on a path to a certain destination. And he said, if you can't win without cheating, you shouldn't be coaching because you are teaching the wrong kind of life lessons to your players. In 2007, federal investigators found that roughly 130 American companies engaged in illegal practice of backdating executive stock options in order to fatten the compensation packages of corporate executives. In his book, Come Home America, William Greider wrote, a few were prosecuted, most pleaded innocent error, and promised not to do it again. The Wall Street Journal suggested that when so many CEOs made the same mistake, it could hardly be considered a crime. William Buffett had a darker view. The 5 most dangerous words in business may be, everyone else is doing it. Raymond Gilmartin, the professor of Harvard University Business School, said, when we were young, I think most of us learned, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, share what you have, respect other people. As we get older, there's a tendency to view things relatively. Don't cheat too much on your spouse or taxes. Don't lie to your friends. Each of these companies didn't intend on losing their moral foundation. They didn't intend on having their CEO prosecuted. They didn't intend on having the pain and the scandal. But their destination wasn't about their intentions. It was about their attentions. As I have the band come up and do this final song, I want to tell you what's so amazing about the Bible. The Bible is a story of grace. Because look at all this heartache and all this pain. And did you know that Jesus comes on the scene and he calls himself a son of David? That guy in the middle. He identifies himself with David. He calls him a man after his own heart. Not a perfect man, not a great moral man, but a man who continually said, God, I messed up again. I need your grace. And God invites into his family anyone who will say, God, I messed up, but I agree with you. I'm on the wrong path. And I agree with you. I need forgiveness. And I agree for you. If you will receive me and accept me, I want to go your way. The story of the Bible is a story of God's grace and God's forgiveness and the fact that he doesn't take saints, he makes saints. He makes us righteous. He makes us